This week on Straight Talking Cyber, what could be seen as a stark warning for Windows 10 users with news of hundreds of vulnerabilities that have impacted those users over recent months. We talk about Apple's innovations on the security front, where it is about to make it significantly easier for iPhone users to make sure they're secure. This is something you really do need to know. Meanwhile, despite the Apple versus Facebook stuff you've read in the headlines, there is a really serious swipe that Apple's just taken at Google. Again, if you use an iPhone, if you use an iPad, if you're on Mac, this is something you really need to know about.
As part of my ongoing hacking is not a crime theme, I've been looking at the number of reported vulnerabilities in Microsoft products across 2020. And those numbers are, you might think, quite shocking. More than 1,200 in total, 900 plus vulnerabilities in Windows products, and 138 critical rated vulnerabilities impacting the Windows Server product line.
That's an absolutely huge number of vulnerabilities, Davey. Is that a bad thing?
Well, there's a twist, of course. Those numbers, despite actually being a near 50% increase over the vulnerabilities reported for Microsoft in 2019, aren't necessarily a bad thing. They illustrate that reporting mechanisms are improving and, importantly, that more talented hackers are signing up to bug bounty programs and discovering these vulnerabilities that otherwise would have just gone unpatched for longer.
So David, we've talked a lot on STC around kind of mobile vulnerabilities, so Apple and Android, and compared the two. How does Windows stack up? I mean, how should people think about this?
I've been doing some digging into where Microsoft slots into the overall published vulnerabilities league table, if you like, for 2020. And according to StackWatch, which monitors these things, Microsoft was number one, and Windows dominated the top 10 by product table with 7 spots out of the 10. But Google came in second, not far behind, with 950 vulnerabilities, of which Android accounted for 696. Apple, interestingly, only came in at 8th with 381 vulnerabilities. iOS was impacted by 233 of those. Now, all of this illustrates why regular security updates, separate from platform point releases, like Patch Tuesday with Microsoft, are so important. And I think you've been looking at this, haven't you, Kate?
Yeah, I have. We've talked about before on STC the idea of just pulling out the security vulnerabilities from the platform vulnerabilities, or not vulnerabilities, but updates, as you said. So in iOS 13, things started to get really, really buggy with Apple. And that's pretty interesting because people started to complain and people started to refuse even more to update their iPhones to new iOS versions. There's debate as to why this has happened, because Johnny Ive left around that time as well, who was obviously thought of as one of Apple's great designers, and he designed iOS, and maybe it was related to that, who knows. But the fact is that, iOS can be very, very buggy. It has been in iOS 14. We've had lots of updates. We've had battery drain issues. We've had all sorts of things. And I do get quite a lot of people complaining to me that iOS 14 is bad. I don't want to update. Should I be updating to the security update? As we've said before, you need to update. But in iOS 15, we've now found out, and it's been confirmed, that Apple is separating out security updates. So when iOS 15, from the time that comes out, we don't have to update our phones without to get the security updates. So there will be security updates for anyone who's on iOS 14 or before that.
Oh, do we expect to see a ton of security updates coming out from Apple on iOS, considering that they do have a lot of vulnerabilities that are usually just wrapped up in a point release? And if so, do people need to install those updates as they happen?
And we are going to see a lot of security updates, I think. I mean, we have seen a lot this year. There's been at least 6 Apple security updates this year now, and we're 6 months in. They tend to be one a month, and they've been urgent updates. Many of these have been exploited in the wild. A lot of these have involved WebKit, which is Apple's browser engine. And it is very, very important that these updates are applied. This new thing where the updates are separated hasn't happened yet. So at the moment, people have to update as soon as these big security updates with platform releases come out from Apple, no matter what, whether it's separating them or not, which sometimes Apple actually does do, and it has done recently. Always update your phone when it's a security update. That's it from me. That's all I can say.
It's okay. I mean, one of the interesting things is obviously Apple, which we talked about before, is a product company and different to other big tech. It's kind of in this release cycle, isn't it? So it wraps up its new iOS version, particularly with new versions of the hardware on which it bases a lot of its annual performance. And is that part of the problem now? iOS is unbelievably complicated compared to where it was, a few generations ago. And they're trying to cram all of this development into a fixed release cycle that coincides with hardware releases, which is quite different to anyone else. Maybe that is just becoming too much of an issue to manage.
It could be, but it's also the fact that Apple itself is becoming more of a services company. Apple used to be very much about selling its hardware and making money from hardware. Of course, it still is doing that. But at the same time, Apple is selling subscriptions now as its main model. So it wants you to be on Apple Music, it wants you to be on the Apple Games, Apple News, and the whole Apple ecosystem. And it's bundling those things in together and making sure that everybody is locked in every way. Now, if you are part of the Apple ecosystem, but you've got an older iPhone, when you update, your iPhone is often going to be even more buggy than other people's iPhones who are on newer ones. So, for example, I'm on an iPhone 12 and the updates have been fine for me. Even in iOS 14, people were saying there have been battery drain issues. I wasn't experiencing those on my iPhone. It's got great battery. But people who have the older hardware are going to experience the bigger issues. Their iPhones aren't going to be able to take this new kind of bigger software very well. So this could be partly from Apple, more of an effort to keep people in its ecosystem than it is to just generate, the need to buy new hardware, which people hate anyway. It makes people angry. They're like, I don't have to buy a new iPhone every time one comes out just so it works properly with iOS. So I think it's fair enough, really.
One of the things I've been looking at this week is with the new Apple update and how that compares. And I know, Kate, you've covered extensively, particularly where Facebook is concerned, the app tracking transparency and kind of privacy levels before that, and how it was a real strike against Facebook's business model. But actually, if you step back now and look at what we've seen in the last few weeks, it's really Google that is more an Apple site than Facebook across a lot of Google's core applications as they relate to Apple users.
Google's been getting away with it in a way. All the focus has been on Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg. Yes, Facebook is a bad company in many, many ways, but Google does such privacy invasive things too. And it feels to have got away scot-free. It's bought out Flock, which is very, very invasive. And it's almost gone under the radar. People don't really seem to be kind of shouting about it in the same way, don't you think?
Absolutely. I think if you look at it, Flock's a great example, and we've talked a lot about that on SDC, and one of the things we'll do over the next few days is tell people how to disable that on their computers. But Flock clearly has kind of brought into sharp relief, Google's approach to tracking and advertising, and Apple with its private relay kind of quasi VPN, if you like, has set itself even further apart with Safari over Chrome. And we've seen a couple of other examples as well. We've seen mail. So we've talked before in SDC around mail tracking, where pixels or images, remote images, enable advertisers and data brokers to track where you are and how often you read emails. And finally, Apple is doing something about it. Guess what? That is in sharp contrast with Gmail. So the world's most popular mail platform clearly retains its ability to track. And we've seen it with maps as well, where Apple is starting to make the case now that you really shouldn't be using Google Maps, particularly on your iPhone, where you're traveling around, kind of goes everywhere with you, given that sitting behind that is the underlying Google tracking framework.
What did Google do next? What do they do to respond to this?
They're really focused on their privacy sandbox, and they're really focused on trying to talk about their privacy improvements and enhancements. And what we're seeing with Android 12 is copying some of Apple's innovations around telling you when your camera's being used and telling you where your microphone's being used. We've seen stuff around location access and limiting location access. We've seen stuff around limiting permissions. We're also going to see stuff around almost like a data locker. So there will be certain data on your phone that is only on your phone and won't be shared with Google. It won't end up on the cloud. There won't be machine learning applied to it. But kind of sitting behind that, what's really interesting is Google's clearly playing a game of privacy catch-up. Not because they are big believers in privacy, but because they have to, because Apple is changing the game. But Google's conflicted because it's the world's largest advertising data broker. And it also owns the underlying IP behind Android and a raft of other services and software platforms. And that is a difficult place or a difficult contortion to find yourself caught up in.
All of its stuff works really well. Yes, you have to give up your privacy, but if you don't care about privacy, it all just works and it all combines itself in together. In contrast, I mean, I know it's changed, but Apple Maps used to be absolutely terrible. Do you remember when Apple Maps first came out?
Yeah, but Apple Maps is really good now. I use CarPlay in my car, and I've been looking at Apple Maps new updates now. And it's way better than Google Maps, way better in the car. Really
there was a backlash when Apple binned Google Maps as the default mapping application in the iPhone. It almost caused riots in the street, partly because everyone really liked Google Maps and partly because Apple Maps was getting everybody lost because it didn't have any accuracy in it. But absolutely, but there's almost like that kind of thinking hasn't really left in a lot of people's minds. A lot of people are still quite tied up with Google Maps. And arguably, Google Maps remains one of Google's stickiest applications for Apple's users, right? I mean, most of us will have Google Maps on our iPhones. But I think you're right, David. I think now Apple has quietly been catching up. And with some of the innovations it's talking about for iOS 15, then you're thinking, you know what? Now's the time to actually ditch what is an unbelievably invasive Google application, because it kind of follows you around. It knows where you're going. It knows when you went, how long it took you to get there, all kinds of stuff.
And talking about catching up with things, where does all of this leave WhatsApp, for example?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because again, on the Apple side, there was a lot of talk that iOS 15 was going to bring real iMessage functionality and feature enhancements to compete better with WhatsApp. We haven't really seen that. What we've seen is Apple becoming a little bit more sticky with sharing stuff over iMessage. For its part, WhatsApp is still fighting the privacy backlash that has consumed it through 2021. Started again with Apple's privacy labels, and then WhatsApp trying to force a change of terms on users where they were going to accept some data sharing with Facebook. WhatsApp is now conducting another privacy campaign. It is emphasizing end-to-end encryption. We've talked about this before, but WhatsApp is constantly putting that front and center in people's minds. And what it's raising is two things. First one is a real irony, because the second most popular messenger in the world behind WhatsApp is Facebook Messenger, which isn't default end-to-end encrypted. So when WhatsApp is going out and telling you need it and Facebook Messenger doesn't have it, it's hard to square the circle on that one, which is kind of WhatsApp saying don't use Facebook Messenger, which is interesting. But also something that we've talked a bit about in SDC and are going to continue to talk about is actually end-to-end encryption. You know, our default view as security professionals is everything should be end-to-end encrypted. And you know, back to Google, we've seen, you know, some client-side end-to-end encryption on Workspace and stuff this week, which again is following that theme. But there is real angst when you add end-to-end encryption in social media, particularly where social media is used by kids, then potentially you create risk. And it pains me to say this as a security professional, but actually I am now advocating for WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger and Instagram to actually to not take the same approach to encryption. I don't mind if Facebook Messenger and Instagram do go end-to-end encryption, but there probably should be kind of warranted backdoors in that to enable law enforcement to monitor that for the safety of children when they suspect something's gone on. I do think it's different with WhatsApp. It's different with Signal, where they're just point-to-point messengers. You need to know the person you're contacting. It's based around phone numbers. And I think, you know, privacy is what we all talk about, but there are balances, checks and balances and safeguards as well. And we're not immune to those.
Can I just say, that I am really glad I didn't wear my Ralph Lauren t-shirt today, because every single week I've been wearing Ralph Lauren t-shirts just by coincidence. I've got lots of white Ralph Lauren t-shirts, and I saw you today and I thought, this is the one decision I made today that was correct. I'm glad.
Yeah, I mean, I was so close to bringing my designer wear out as well.